Okay, let's get started, everyone. Today is Groundhog Day, and so this is our winter then and now, another in our sense of place events for the Mill Hollow Heritage Association. Starting with the now, I want to know, because it's Groundhog Day, where you are, did the groundhog see his shadow? Betsy, let's start with you.
I would say no. It was a very cloudy day and we had some snow in the morning here in Boston.
Okay, so not in Boston. Steve, how about you up in Plainfield, New Hampshire?
I think the groundhog stayed in his burrow. He didn't even come out and saw all the snow piled up. There was
Uh,
no coming out.
okay. Jim Howard, how about in Walpole? Did the
Oh,
groundhog
and
see?
Alstead, I live in Alstead.
Oh, you're in Alstead. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
and I think they looked for the shadow in the morning, and we definitely had clouds in the morning. We had just a ray of sun in the late afternoon here.
Okay.
But in the morning, he would not have seen his shadow.
And Peter in the Rhodes District in Alstead.
Oh, no shadows here today.
No shadows. Okay. And Ellen, she's gone, but I
No
wanted to ask
shadows.
about Mill Hollow. I assume it was no shadows there either. That means, as we all know, that winter will end fairly soon. And me not being a fan of winter, I'm all for it. So it's interesting that Groundhog Day is also called Candlemas Day. Brendan, could you bring up our first slide?
Sure thing, just one moment.
Okay. There we are. Good, thank you. So Groundhog Day is also called Candlemas Day. And the saying about fair and clear, there'll be two winters in the year. So the superstition about Candlemas is exactly on February 2nd, we are in for more in the one would winter then and now mark a sort of division in the winter season. And I brought this totally new age looking sketch into the slideshow to talk a little bit about what Candlemas or Groundhog Day is. It's one of the so-called cross quarter days. So we're all familiar with the astronomical events that you see on the four sides of the square. We have the vernal equinox coming in March, a little bit before Easter. The summer solstice, June 21st, 22nd. The autumnal equinox in September, that marks the beginning of autumn. And finally, the winter solstice a few months ago, which is our Christmas season. So those are the very clear astronomical events, but in between them, at the corners of the square, we have what's called the cross quarter days. And those cross quarter days, like the solstice and equinox days, were pagan feast days. So they were pagan or heathen holidays with certain superstitions associated with them, just like our sayings about Candlemas and Groundhog Day. And then they were all taken over by the Christian calendar. So we know that vernal equinox kind of became Easter. May Day, the 1st of May, became the feast day of the Virgin Mary. And May Day celebrations, that's way over around the circle. And we Christian era, feast day of St. John the Baptist. So John the Baptist, we have no idea when he was actually born, but the familiar loaf mass, that's a feast day grain harvest. So loaf mass, when you could festival the Assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven. And then the autumnal equinox in September, and finally All Hallows, that's All Hallows. So it's the eve of All. Of course, we have with Halloween having to do with death and reverence for the dead, connected with the time of year when the vegetation dies down and we see the very, very beginnings of the approach of winter. So a little good reason for landing this on Groundhog Day. Brendan, let's have the next slide.
Maybe I should unplug that
I don't care.
because that ring's in this ring
How do you unplug it?
from the wall.
Oh,
Okay, this slide is obviously a snowy day in Mill Hollow. So as we look back upon this, we don't know exactly when this was taken, sometime in the past. So my question to my panelists, first of all, is what's the biggest snowstorm that you can remember? Not counting today, but the biggest snow. Let's start with Betsy.
Well, gee, I would say here in Boston, the blizzard of 1978 would definitely have been it. We got more than 27 inches of snow in 32 hours. And here in the city, oh my gosh, it was unbelievably quiet. That's what I remember, the quietness. And we have next to our house, we have a sloped ramp for my son who uses a wheelchair. He was a teenager back then. And the ramp came up to a lift so he could get into his room. And the snow had drifted so high over his ramp that we dug a tunnel through it. And he would come down the lift and come shooting through several feet of tunnel to the street, which he thought was quite fun. Of course, when he got to the sidewalk, the snow was just piled up, like 5, 6, 7 feet high. But that was definitely what I think of as the biggest snowstorm.
Interesting to think of how people adapt to getting around in the snow. Jim Howard, you were living in Massachusetts in that time, and I think you said a pretty rural town. Is that right?
Well, the town was Lincoln. It's a small rural town, not as rural as Alstead, but it did have 6 working dairy farms in it. But most of the people worked in Boston. But when my biggest storm was the blizzard of '78. There was nothing like it before or after. But I, by that time, was 39 years old, and I was living in Watertown, which is closer to Boston.
Yeah.
It's about 8 miles out. And I was working in Copley Square. I was developing computer systems. And the thing I remember most is that the morning of the storm, that they really weren't predicting that it was going to be terrible. We were going to have snow, but by 2 o'clock, our company, they announced on the company speaker system that the storm was bad and we could all go home. And I remember I got the last bus from Copley Square to Newton Corner. And after that, the bus system closed down. And I could walk. Then it was a 5-minute walk to my apartment. And the big thing to remember about that is the snow came down so hard that cars were just stopped in their track. And the next day, the governor of Dukakis came on and announced that no cars or anything would be allowed on the road. So as a result, I couldn't go to work. It was a Monday, and I had that whole week off, and no cars were allowed on the road. And you wondered if you're going to be able to buy food. And I was able to walk to supermarkets and buy it. But the most impressive thing was the fact that no cars, trucks delivering groceries and so on were allowed, and obviously ambulances and so on. But one of the reasons that Betsy found Boston so quiet is because there were no cars allowed.
Right, right.
Excuse me. So I wanted to know when it was this snowy in Mill School.
I don't really remember, but we did when we went to the East Alstead school, the one-room school. Unless the temperature was below about 8 degrees, and then the worst snowstorms I remember were when I was living in Massachusetts, and so you don't want to hear about that. But
Ellen, where did you go to school though in Alstead?
there was
Which
the East Alstead school, one-room school. We went there for the first 6 years of our schooling. Was up on North Road beyond the church.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's now someone's home, so it's not
Yeah.
recognizable as a schoolhouse anymore.
But you walked.
Yes, as a rule, we walked. It was about a little over 1.25 miles, I believe.
Wow.
And I do remember one time, my cousin Ann Burroughs and I walked home together usually. And once we got bored with the walking, and we dug ourselves a little snow fort in the snowbank next to the road, which I guess now would be considered a little bit dangerous. But anyway, we were rather late getting home, and our moms.
Peter, how about you? And where did you go to school, and did you walk?
We went to school up in Ackworth and for grade school, and we walked a mile to the bus stop at the end of Rhodes Road. Most of the time, well, some of the time. Then my mother started driving the feeder bus route with her. I don't remember. Were very many. Recollections of snow in school early in the afternoon in a bad storm. Sometimes it wouldn't get out early. In any case,
Of schools for our town, saying that all school would be virtual today because of the snow. And I was thinking, what a shame. Kids will not have the excitement that many of us had of looking forward to snow days, because now they'll all be online.
Oh,
It'll
that's
be
right. Yeah.
virtual.
Yeah. And that was New schooling going on. So if it's a snow day, you get the snow day. Yes. Brendan, can you bring up the next slide? Thank you. Okay, this is an interesting contraption. Is Margaret there? And can Margaret?
Technical difficulties, and she's been trying to get.
I'm here now. I'd rather talk about this is our dad's snowplow. He built it in the mill. He did by me. Into the last one. Have a particularly was about 1948, plus or minus a couple of years. This prediction great that state road sooner than we could if we waited for town plows locally. And it seems that during the snowstorm, or just after, some neighbors in East Alstead up on the common called and said, we cannot get out of our house. We cannot open the screen door because of the amount of snow. And in case of fire, of course, that would be terrible. So there were 3 elderly people living there. And Mrs. Cutting was the owner, and 2 others lived with her, including the school teacher. Well, Dad had parked the truck in the mill, and the snow was so heavy that town trucks could not move it. So they had to wait for larger state trucks. So 2 or 3 days into this, Dad was down in the mill working because he could. And he heard a state truck coming up High Bridge Hill. So he went out and hailed the driver and said, if you would take a swing around my mill yard here, I could shovel and get my truck out. And then I could drive to East Alstead and free these people who were in their house. Well, Mother and Dad and Ellen and I all went in the truck together. And we went to East Alstead, as near to the Cutting house as we could, and had our snowshoes with us. And we only had 3 pairs of snowshoes. So Mom and Dad and I each had a pair, and Ellen stood on the back of Mother's pair, and the 2 had to coordinate their walk. And we walked up to the Cutting front door. And on the way in, we sort of bumped our heads on the electric wire coming down from the pole to the house. And that's what I remember about that trip. The snowshoe part especially.
One other comment about the truck here. Dad built this little cabin on the back of the truck, and he outfitted it with a little sheet metal stove so that he could sleep in it if he wanted to. And I think he kind of thought that was a really fun project to make it so that he could sleep in it. And I don't know that he ever actually did, but it was a great project.
It just looks so clever, this homemade snowplow, that when you can see it close enough up, you realize is made of boards. So it's a wooden snowplow, which must have been really heavy, but quite a contraption. Yeah.
And this truck still lives up the road from us here.
Yes.
It's been beautifully newly painted, and it still works.
Good. I'm sure people in Alstead are happy to see it around still. Okay, Brendan, may we have the next slide? Thank you. One of the sayings about Candlemas Day is half your wood and half your hay you should have by Candlemas Day. So those of us who heat by wood are taking a long look at the wood pile, and is it still halfway there? So what are we looking at here? Peter, can you start us off? Is this firewood or lumber or what?
Well, that appears to be firewood there. Looks like short pieces, fairly small, waiting to go into a fireplace or stove.
Okay. And does anybody know who the kid is sitting on top? And what is that little building in front of the shed of the mill?
I can answer that. That might be our father sitting up there. I don't know, but it'd be sort of like him. Anyway, he's sitting on the roof of a shed that's over a circular saw. On the right-hand end of it here toward you is the saw, and there's a carriage under there. And the right-hand part of the end would hinge around and cover the left-hand side. And then half the roof would be supported straight up. So this was a covered saw rig, and the three people would run it. On the right-hand end of it, there would be a man standing, and he would load a log onto the carriage. The second man would operate the carriage, pushing it forward against a circular saw. And the third person would take off, meaning take hold of the wood that as it was being sawed off and fling it behind him onto that great pile. So that's how that pile got made.
I'd say.
And I remember being the man that took off from the saw, and it was a pretty scary saw blade. And it was many years later, I happened to read Robert Frost's poem called Out, Out, which is a story of an accident with a circular saw. One day, Dad volunteered to cut up wood for Carol Hatch, who lived in the house just below the mill. And so we went there, and he ran the carriage. I don't know who did the putting on the wood, but Dad ran the carriage and I took off. And I would fling the two pieces of wood at a time behind me onto the wood pile. And at one point, one of the sticks of wood caught in my mitten. And as I flung it back, it came up and whacked me on the back of the head. And it was pretty shocking. And I thought it shudder to think about how I could have fallen against the blade, but I didn't. I'm here to tell about it. There are many things that were kind of dangerous that we wouldn't want our own kids to do these days.
Exactly. Brendan, can we take a look at the next slide, please? So like Ellen, I have been the takeaway man on a circular saw rig that's powered by our 1946 John Deere. Peter, you said you had helped Heman with this saw. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm assuming it was that one. It would have been back about 1960 or so. I can't remember exactly what I was doing, but I remember getting paid $1 or $2 for that day up at the Grace Corbin. So I must have done something helpful, but I'm guessing I was probably 10 years old. Yeah.
What powered this saw? It looks like Heman could drive it around, right? So he could drive it up to the Corbin place and saw wood up there.
Actually, this is somebody else's vehicle.
Oh, it is?
He made this for someone else. Yeah.
And is this just being transported, or is it
No, I think it operated there. I'm not sure of that, but how else would it have? Yeah, how else would it have been supported?
The home saw rig was powered by our Model L John Deere tractor, which had a power takeoff pulley on the side, and that's how it ran.
And this is familiar, and as Ellen suggested, I think all of us who have used one of these are grateful that we still have both of our hands.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Brenda, next slide, please. This has been a source of fascination and curiosity. Peter, did you ever use this thing?
No. But there's modern versions of it being made and sold today. So I think Heman had an idea that was ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Yes, this was a mechanical screw that he would put with the lever that he's got his right hand on. He would pull that, which would force the log on against that conical screw, which theoretically would split the wood. And apparently it didn't work as well as he had hoped it would, but it was such an interesting contraption that one of our neighbors said he wanted it to mount over his fireplace like a hunting trophy.
Is it still around, Ellen? We have so many old machines in the mill. Do we still have the pieces of that?
That I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
Okay,
It may be over somebody's fireplace. We don't know.
yeah, all right. Huh. Next slide, please, Brendan. Thank you. Steve, you told us about this last time.
Lake Warren.
Can you unmute yourself, Steve?
How about that?
Good.
Okay, they're moving hay from a barn to another barn where the animals are waiting to be fed. Two possibilities here. One could be that on this farm, they had another barn or two sort of out in the more distant mowings, so that when they hayed and they were in a hurry to beat the thunder showers, they had a storage spot right close by. They'd get the hay in then, and then when you had plenty of time on your hands in the winter, you go out and fetch hay and bring it down to the farmstead. Another possibility is they had run out of hay at the farm and they had gone to a neighbor's and bought some hay. As you see, this was loose hay, which was the norm then. It was long before hay balers.
Yeah.
And those boys up on top obviously been charged with treading it down so it wouldn't jiggle off. And with those oxen there, they're going to bring that on home. The teamster looks like might be son and father on the ground, but that's a cute picture.
And if we could see underneath the hay well enough, we'd see runners on this thing, right?
Right, yes.
And what do you call it? These things that traveled on ice and snow? A sledge, a scoot, a skid?
I think of a scoot more as a single set of runners. I think they would call this a sledge.
A sledge, okay, good. And then,
It'd be local, local colloquialism. Different areas will have a different term. I'm sure in Maine, they use these a lot in the woods. They'd have a whole different vocabulary,
yeah.
particularly loggers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Brendan, the next one. So I wanted to show this picture for a couple of reasons. This is, I think, Margaret, you had a description of this and the horses here and what the third one is doing closer to the road.
Well, the horses are being watered at what we always called the watering place. I think it historically has been called that and used for that.
It's now called Lake Edith.
Yeah.
What else there? Yeah, right.
And Margaret, did you tell me that the third horse closer to the road could respond to voice commands?
That's what I always heard, yes. And another picture of this, four of them, 3 horses and a man, show the horses. He's driving the team, and then the third one is going along the road, leading all the others.
Huh. One of the reasons I wanted to put this slide in here is this little piece of land and the Lake Edith there in the middle was given to the mill. This property was given to the mill by Chris Madigan. So this was a gift from a very considerable donor. And we're looking forward to being able to sort of recreate this little water body so that children can play there in the summer and experiment with floating their little boats, or seeing if on that very, very small dam that you see there, if they can build little model water wheels and see how they work there. It just strikes me as a wonderful place for kids to play in the summertime. Nothing better than playing in the water on a hot day. It's not very deep, and we're looking forward very much to being able to restore it.
Where is this?
Where is?
Where
It's
is this?
just below the Lake Warren Dam, and this is Prentice Hill Road that you see in the background.
Okay.
Next slide, Brendan. Okay. This one, Steve, I think this one is, tell us about the vehicle here and what seems to be going on.
Well, they're out on the ice, and then I'll bet they're getting ready to cut some ice, and they're going to load those chunks up on there on the body of that that sledge, and head up to the ice house for storage, so they'll have ice come summer. I noticed they got blankets on those horses, so obviously they're expecting them to stand around for extended periods of time while all this activity is taking place. And I think the guy there in the middle towards the left, he might have a saw in his hands for cutting ice. It looks like one of those.
Without out.
Think so.
Seriously?
Yeah. And I wanted to see the next slide, Brendan, if we could, and then I have some more questions about it.
Oh, here
This-
we are. Yeah.
Okay, so Steve, a couple of things. Are we looking at cut pieces of ice in the foreground?
Oh, here?
Yeah.
You can't tell.
Yeah, they're going to pull those blocks of ice up out. I think they're going to use horsepower, and they probably got some those heavy tongs that they clamp onto the block and then snake it up out. But they're cutting right here where the men are all standing.
So person in my family told me an awful story about watching people cut ice on a pond in Newington in the early 1940s. And what she said was that the horses began to fall into the water. They were standing on the edge of ice, too close to the water itself, and began to fall in, which sounds terrifying. And I don't know what happened then. She was swiftly removed from the scene as if this was something children should not see, but the horses got home all right. That's all I know. Was this a real danger, Steve?
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of hazards. I've gone to a couple of these events at Keyser Lake over in North Sutton, and I'll tell you, I don't want to get too close to that open water. I just it gives me the creeps. But there are all kinds of brave guys and people that were willing to do that. Yeah, it was dangerous. You got heavy commodities. Another thing is you've got cold. I mean, you fell in that water right there, and you'd go hypothermic in a very, very short time, particularly if you had on heavy clothing. It would have, be very dangerous. It was like most all kinds of farm work and physical labor during those times. They did a lot of things that today we would be very leery or we just wouldn't do. It would be too dangerous.
Brendan, the next slide, bring up our ice tongs. These are in the mill, and this is a pair of good old ice tongs. One more piece of the working life of Mill Hollow that has come down to us in Chase's Mill and stays right there. I've always been sort of questioning how it was to lift or move those chunks of ice with these tongs. How well did that work, Steve?
Oh, worked very well. You have a horse over on solid ice and a chain coming back and going through those rings up at the top there. And plunge it down in and grab a hold of a block of ice. And they probably, I'm sure they would have planks to make a ramp to pull that ice block up out of the water. And that was a very, very practical and ingenious way of handling them, getting them up out of the water.
Good. I'm glad to know that it did work.
And little Helen.
Yeah. Please, Peter, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. One thing nobody mentioned here is in addition to the ice saws, before they used the saws themselves, they had what was called an ice plow to score the ice with. And that was pulled by the horses or oxen across the ice and score the ice. We still had one in my grandfather's barn when he passed away, and along with the ice saws and tongs. And so the horses had to be out there on the ice doing that, as well as pulling those blocks out. And one thing my uncle said that you rarely hear about or see in the pictures is that in order for the horses to stand up safely on the ice and get traction, they used to spread manure on top of the ice since that was the only thing they had to give the animals traction out there. It doesn't quite fit the pretty picture of ice cutting, but he
Yeah.
said that's how it was done.
Okay. I want to see the next slide, Brendan, please. I put this slide in because Margaret told me, I think, which building what the ice would have been kept in. Margaret, can you explain that?
It was in what was called the sheep barn, the high barn to the right. And my dad said it was in one corner of that barn. And then the house that which they used in the house would have to be hauled down the hill around the mill there into that brick house that's in the background.
And it was packed in sawdust for insulation, is that right?
Right.
And did it actually keep all through the summer?
I guess so. It must have. Is there what, I don't know what other ways people would have had to insulate it.
Mm-hmm.
Steve know more about that?
There was some use of straw, but nothing beats sawdust.
Mhm.
Sawdust was ideal.
Mhm.
The very best ice houses would have a double wall to make a very deep partition around, all the way around the perimeter, and they'd fill that with sawdust. And then when they put the blocks of ice in the enclosed space, they'd spread sawdust all over that ice. And it's hard to believe, but it works. You can go to the Musterfield farm up in Sutton in August, and they'll pull out cakes of ice that were cut from Keezer Lake in January, and they'll use it to make ice cream or whatever. And it was big business. I mean, bear in mind, there's no refrigeration in the 19th century to speak of, and that was how we kept things cool. Very important. It was big business. I mean, they would ship it to the Caribbean from the ports of Boston and Newburyport.
Go ahead, Betsy.
Well, I grew up in Connecticut near the shore, and there was a pond right behind us. And next to the pond was an old ice house made of stone. It was maybe a story and a half high, I think, and it had a very narrow doorway. And as kids, we would go jump down in, and it had sawdust
Yeah.
still in there, but it was very dark and mysterious because the only light was where that door had been. And there were a couple of old sleighs in there, I remember, probably just being stored in there. And I always wished I could have seen it filled with ice or seen them chopping it out of the lake as you've been describing.
Mhm. And I grew up on a farm, and we had what we always called the sawdust house, and that's where bedding was kept for the cattle. But my father always called it the ice house. And just to give you an idea of the difference in the value of ice by the seasons, of course, in the summertime, ice was a scarce commodity. But if he wanted to speak about somebody who only pretended to be generous, he'd say, yeah, he'd give away ice right in the middle of winter. Next slide, please, Brendan.
What you mean?
Okay, now it's time to look at some things that people did for fun in the wintertime. So let's imagine that we're looking at Mill Hollow on a snow day when kids don't have to go to school. And Brendan, show us the next slide, if you would. Okay, this, as most people will recognize, is State Route 123. So sliding right down the state highway. And we talked about this a little bit last night. I think, Ellen, I asked you or Margaret how far a kid would have gone sledding downhill from here.
Margaret answered that.
And she said not too far. Go ahead,
I
Margaret.
would say not nearly as far as you'd think. It's not as steep as you might think. Not everywhere. I mean, this made wonderful sliding right here. Please imagine that this picture and the one we've just seen before it are taken from pretty much the same place. If you turned around and looked behind you, And you would see, you'd be looking down at the mill and up at that hillside. And you remember that that looked pretty steep there. Well, this is one of the Heckman kids, which dates this around 1920-ish or so.
Mhm.
And the road may not have been paved at that time either. So it was a fairly, well, to our way of thinking, a primitive road by that at that time.
Steve, you mentioned yesterday that this could have been during the time period when they were still rolling the roads instead of actually scraping them down or plowing. And Margaret has just said she's guessing 1920. Explain for people who don't know what it meant to roll the roads. Snow rollers.
Towns, instead of plowing, would have these big wooden rollers. I mean, they were enormous, and they would pull them with the 2 or 3 hitches of oxen or horses to pack down the snow rather than plow it, and make a really hard surface, just like you're seeing here. This youngster coming down what appears to me to be a roadway that has been packed. But if you say 1925, that would be about the tipping point when towns began to plow to accommodate the motor car, and we were drifting away from using horses and oxen. They rolled the roads because it made them firm and hard in the winter. And actually, for a lot of transport, they looked forward to winter when they could pack the roads. It was far better than mud and dust and washboard. So I think this is a good example, and it was wonderful for what they used to call coasting. And some kids would do it in the prone position, as this fellow was doing, and others like to sit on the thing and steer with their feet.
Yeah.
It was great fun, but today with gravel, sand, and road salt, there aren't many places where you can coast on that kind of a sled.
Yeah, and good for sledding, good for sleighing too.
Yes.
Good. Some more about fun things to do in the wintertime. Brendan, how about the next slide, please? This is another one of those artifacts that we find in Chase's Mill. This is a pair of old skates, the kind that you would use, I believe, strap on over your shoes. Probably not as fine as the skates that we have today, but suggest to us people being able to skate on Lake Warren. So let's take a look, Brendan, at the next slide. This is a wonderful slide. Who knows who these people are?
That's Carl and Catherine Dennett, who used to own the Warren house that was in the previous slide.
That was the Warren house.
Yeah.
And Ellen, give us about what time period are we talking here?
I'm guessing, Margaret, do you know? Maybe the 1930s?
Yeah, maybe.
One of our favorite activities in the winter, of course, was skating whenever the conditions were good. And I remember one year someone had the brilliant idea of hauling some old tires down onto the ice and setting them on fire, which made a glorious fire at night, certainly, but an awful smell, which lingered. But then the next day, I remember on one occasion, the next day we discovered that there were these coils of thin wire that had something to do with tire construction. And so we strung these long pieces of wire out and strung on the wire beer cans that we had found on the island. We felt like we were good citizens picking up trash on the island. Here were all these beer cans, so we strung them on the wires, and they made a glorious sound when we dragged them around on the ice.
I want to know if you could skate now on Lake Warren, Ellen. Is it that hard frozen?
Oh, it's very hard, and in fact, people have been driving pickup trucks on it, and there are several bob houses out on the ice. I have too much imagination to enjoy walking on ice that I can't see, and of course now it's covered with snow.
Yeah.
So skating is not Very good.
Yeah, and when it's covered with snow, I like to ski on lakes. I go skiing on Crescent Lake in Ackworth. It's flat. And for people who are not terribly good at cross-country skiing but enjoy it, flat is good. I want to know about
Helen, notice where these folks are skating, that all that surface has been cleared off for the purpose.
Yeah. And on Crescent Lake too, people clear it off to play hockey. So Jim Howard, were you a hockey player? Okay. Jim, unmute yourself. Jim, can you unmute yourself? Unmute.
Mute.
There you are.
Hear?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Great. Did you play hockey?
Okay. I did. I played hockey in high school, and I played on the freshman team in college. And what I remember was when I was young, you know, like say 12, 13, there was a big pond near our house in Lincoln, and it was always frozen by Thanksgiving Day. And that's where we would skate. There were no rinks, there were no artificial rinks. But by the time of the 60s, it would never freeze by Thanksgiving Day. But way back in the late 40s and early 50s, it seemed to be colder, and we could always play hockey on Thanksgiving Day. I remember that.
Peter, did you play hockey?
No, I never learned to skate. There were 7 kids in our family, and of course my parents couldn't afford to buy everybody skates, so sometimes we had hand-me-downs or whatnot, and sometimes we had a pair of skates that fit one of us but not another, and I guess I never had a pair of skates that fit me long enough to ever really learn, and so I never have.
Steve, were you a hockey player?
Absolutely not. I like to stay in where it's warm.
Oh. You know, in my day, girls did not play hockey. So my brothers played hockey. There was a small skating rink at the school that I went to, just an ordinary grammar school back in the day. And the fire department came and flooded it regularly. And we always had ice. And so girls wore figure skates, as they were called. We skated, and boys played hockey. But it was a gender segregated sport back in the day.
That's what we did for fun in the winter. We often, it seemed like it was pretty often that if we had guests or neighbors came in the evening, we would, of course, we had no TV, so we would play a game called Dumb Crambo, which involved acting and rhyming words. And there were also card games. Just the other day, I came across a loan card, which was from the Game of Authors. It was a picture of Sir Walter Scott and the title Ivanhoe. And I credit the Game of Authors, which we played often, with giving me the illusion of being well read. But of course, I had not read most of the books. But by the time I got to high school and college, if someone mentioned well, some of the well-known writers, I would remember what they wrote, even though I hadn't read the books.
Betsy, you said you were a figure skater back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it always seems, just as Jim said, that we skated all winter. Of course, that's an illusion, but with a pond right near us, as soon as it was frozen, we were out there. And what I thought was really fun was that the pond was a place that was very familiar to us, except for the very swampy far reaches. But in the winter on our ice skates, we could skate to those places that we ordinarily, you know, didn't know much about, and were inaccessible. So that was very fun. And we certainly, if it snowed, we shoveled the snow, you know, right off so that we could skate, just as has been done in this photo. But to our dismay, on the weekends, big boys and men would come and take over our space and play hockey. And there were too many of them for us to, so we had to just wait till they were gone. But I was also telling you that was a sort of a slightly embarrassing story when I was a teenager. I was really a pretty good ice skater. And when I was skating around one time, a man asked me to skate with him, that kind of gracious skating that they're doing here. And I guess I was kind of thrilled that he recognized that I was a good skater, but I was totally embarrassed and self-conscious to be skating arm in arm with a man, somebody I didn't even know. I don't believe he was wearing a necktie like, like Carl is in this picture.
You ever see him again, Betsy?
I don't think so.
Oh, too bad. Brenda, next slide, please. I put this slide in just to give us the idea of sleigh rides, not a modern sleigh, but obviously something people did with great pleasure and still do. Brian, one more slide. Next one, please, Brendan. Thank you. This photo comes to us courtesy of Janet Warren from the Warren Farm in Alstead on Hill Road. And I put this in because, first of all, such beautiful, beautiful horses, people going for a sleigh ride. And the other thing is you notice people wearing masks. So in years to come, we will always know when this photograph was taken. People wearing masks, it can only be during the coronavirus epidemic, and that will date it. Brendan, one last slide to leave off on, if you would, please. Okay. This is a winter picture. It's not very deep snow, but this is obviously in front of the mill. And we've got a group of kids here who look like they've been doing some woodworking. And I'd like to know now if we can just open it up and unmute people. And I'm depending on Bryony to help us manage things here. And I'd like to know if any of the kids in this picture are with us tonight.
It may be a little, it may be small to identify.
Is anybody volunteering to say I was there? Brendan, how do we open it up so we can see all of our participants? Can you make that happen?
No.
I bet two of them are Nostrand boys because they're so tall.
I am holding a copy of more than no, Short History of Mill Hollow. That picture is in it. And shall I tell you who the people are?
Sure, yes.
Eddie Hatch, who lives in this community, Jim Pecora also, Jimmy Fenn, John Nostrand, Jimmy and Rusty Fenn. So 3 Fenn boys they were on East Alstead on the Common, Pecora, Nostrand, and Hatch.
And can any of the people who are here tell us what they were doing or making there?
Can we go back to the photo, please?
Yeah, Brendan, can you make the photo appear again?
Yeah, we're working on it. Sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
My guess is they are showing off 3 mill projects. You see on the ground is a birdhouse. In Jim Pecora's hand is a cutting board in the shape of an apple. And on the ground in front of one of the fens, 2 fens, there's a little water mill.
Oh,
that whole thing.
yeah. Okay. Bryony, can you open it up so that we can look at or hear from other people in the chat function or give other people a chance to participate?
Yes, well, we can definitely, there were a couple of really interesting stories in the chat earlier on. A couple people had memories of Heman doing some wood cutting. I don't know if anyone wants to speak about that. Ed Spur remembers when the highway department straightened the road below the mill. Ed, do you want to tell that story?
And Brendan, excuse me for a minute. Brendan, can you stop screen sharing so that we can see the participants at this point?
Yes, give me one moment and it should be off in about 30 seconds to a minute.
Okay.
or anyone else who has a story to share they wanted to share about winter. We're open for anybody to join.
Well, we used to close off the Pratt Road, and at Bennett Road, we'd park a car and have some people at the top, and we'd have a car down at the bottom, right at the driveway there, and we would sled through the night before the plow would come in the morning.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was a
Who
pretty
is that
fast hill.
Who is that speaking?
It's Jean Balamuth.
Ah,
Ah,
There we are.
Yeah.
There we are.
This is Jonathan Bodkin. I have two memories that come to mind. One is of skating on Lake Warren when I was probably, I don't know, 10 years old or something, or around that time. And I was skating and skated out towards the Narrows, not realizing that I was going with the wind, and turned around and found that I couldn't skate back against the wind. And luckily my Uncle Seth was out there on the ice with me, and he had a hockey stick. I don't remember why he had his hockey stick, though I know he wasn't an avid hockey player, but so he towed me back upwind all the way back to wherever it was we started, probably the beach at the Warren houses. And then probably before that, when I was younger, I remember up on the hill near the American Wing, I guess the Browns had created a really fancy track for tobogganing
Right.
that was really, really fun. And I was probably young enough that it seemed like it went for half a mile or something. That was probably pretty short.
Jonathan, given that you later worked in wind power, did that have anything to do with trying to make your headway against the wind and being towed back home?
might have scared me off, but I just remember distinctly holding on to that hockey stick and being very tired.
I have a memory of being out on the ice as a young grown-up. This is Linda doing from Tiemann Place. And it was in the middle of the winter, and we usually didn't come up in the winter because we had no heat in the house and it was so bitterly cold. But we did come up and stayed for a few nights, and we went out on the lake, which was deeply frozen, and we did headstands in the middle of the lake because it was so liberating to feel you could do anything you wanted in all that open space.
Hi, Helen, this is Julie Stevens. Jonathan, we would take a sheet or whatever, hold between two of us so it would blow us all the way across the lake. And then we fight our way back. And, but we loved being blown all the way across.
Yeah. And Julie, were you on skates when you did that?
Yes, we were on skates. That was skating.
Good. Okay. Other fun experiences on the lake or sliding?
How about a quick question about skating on the lake, which is I'm eager to do it in the present, but right now I notice that it's very bumpy and lumpy. And do people ever like spray it down, or how do people get it so that it's skatable when there's not snow on it?
you wait.
You wait for Mother Nature. You wait
Yes.
for a lovely rain, and you get out there before the snowmobiles. We didn't have to worry about snowmobiles in the old days.
Ah.
And Julie, I think I might have skated across this Jim Gruber. I might have skated. There was a bunch of us. We had a huge sheet of plastic once, maybe 8 of us with a huge sheet of plastic and ice skates, and we just blew across that lake. It was hard getting back.
I have a personal winter story that doesn't involve the lake, but it certainly was winter. When when I entered sixth grade, our teacher, Mrs. Haynes, retired and was replaced by Gertrude Putnam, who lived right up the road on Old Settlers Road. And as all good students will do, we tested her resolve. My cousin Anne and I, who were sort of partners in crime in a lot of ways, we arrived one day, a snowy day, and we told Mrs. Putnam that we had forgotten our skirts, and so we could not take our snow pants off. And she said, well, that was too bad, because snow pants were for outdoor wear, and so we would just have to wait outside. So of course, wanting to wear snow pants was not an unreasonable idea, because I remember girls always had mottled blue legs from being cold and having to wear skirts. So we went outside, and we didn't know quite what to do, but eventually we got cold. So to get out of the wind and the cold, we crawled under the schoolhouse porch and lay there in the snow for a while until we got really bored and really cold. And so then we went back in the schoolhouse. We told Mrs. Putnam that miraculously we had discovered that we were wearing our skirts under our snow pants. And she said, well, she was glad of that, and we could come back and join the class.
Great story.
I remember those
Back up.
days, and I remember not being allowed to wear pants in school. And I remember waiting for the school bus when it was very, very cold, and we were not allowed to wear pants. And I still say I'm insensitive to cold below the waist for life because of that.
And I have chilblains for life from all that cold.
Yeah.
I can remember a couple of times we would be up there for Christmas, and there's just wonderful experiences when the snow would melt on the top and then it would freeze, and there was a full moon. And I did this maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of the years. But you would just go out and skate, and it was all bright under the moon, and it was just absolutely magnificent. And it reminded me of William Wordsworth wrote a long autobiographical poem called The Prelude, and he talks about experiences skating under the full moon in the Lake Country in England. And so whenever I would have this experience, I'd go back and dig out that poem and listen to it. And read it again. It was a very memorable experience.
Being here tonight brought back so many memories of coming up at the lake. We didn't live there all winter, but we'd come up every vacation, and we'd come up in the winter time. And my father, we just had the wood stove, and my father would go down to the lake, cut a hole, bring up the lug water up to the house, and my mother would melt snow for drinking water, and then he'd set up sort of like a porta potty in the bathroom, and we just had the best time. And we used to build snow forts and have snowball fights with the Hatch kids, and we just had the best time. But I remember one winter, it was so cold. My father hung blankets, and we all had to we were all in one room. And my mother said the next day, we are leaving, because it was like, I think the highest that he could get it. I mean, it was below freezing in the living room, and we were just all huddled together. And I think it was New Year's Eve. So my mother got pots and pans, and we were banging pots and pans at midnight. But we had many adventures up there. My father he loved getting up here and getting back to, I guess, what he thought was his roots. And that was my brother in the picture. I didn't want to say anything, but I was looking at that picture. I said, that really looks like my brother Jim. And that was my brother, Jim Pecora. So I'm Barbara Prentice, but we grew up, I spent every summer of my life at the lake. So special place for us, still is.
Helen, I'm noticing it's a little after 9 o'clock, which was when we planned to end this event. So I don't know if we want to ask for one more closing story, and we can close the formal portion, and people can hang out a little while longer if they like. I know we sometimes do it that way.
Let's do it that way, Bryony, and let people hang out if they would like to. Margaret, you wanted to say something else.
Well, perhaps we should mention back in history that Erastus Kidder.
Oh, yes.
Kidder and Banks and Messer, were the three mill owners who had, all of them had sawmills down the brook and below the mill. And they all three had sawmills, and they all three had boarding houses, and they were real rivals in both of these endeavors. And they weren't very nice to each other sometimes. Well, Erastus Kidder owned a very small house, which was across the 123 from the Warren House, just about where the Dennett garage stands now. And he wanted to move that little house out onto the pond shore. But to do it, he would have to move it over Banks's land. And Banks said no. So what was his solution? He waited until the lake was totally frozen over very well. And then with teams of oxen, he moved that little house across on the ice. That little house is still there. Belongs to Annie Hess Azaka, and there it stands in perfectly good shape. And so I thought you ought to know that the ice surface does more than just our recreation, but also moved a house. Now, of course, Kidder rented the house to a family that had children, and then he told the town they would have to build a road out there because those children had to go to school. And Mr. Banks protested terribly, but the town won out. And that's how we came to have Pine Cliff Road in the first place.
Thank you for that story, Margaret. That's a piece out of Heman Chase's Short History of Mill Hollow. People didn't always get along. And sometimes the ice is a bridge across the lake, and that enables people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. Okay, I'm going to leave the meeting now, but other people are welcome to hang out and to chat as long as you would like. And I want to thank you very, very much for coming, and special thanks to our panelists for their expertise and their memories and their sharing. So good night.
Good night.
Thank you.